The fiancé drenched the maid in front of everyone. Then the billionaire made a shocking decision. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. I wasn't going to tell this story, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. Picture this: a glittering ballroom, hundreds of guests in diamonds and silk, and a 29-year-old fiancé who thought she ruled the room. She threw an entire glass of red wine on a 28-year-old maid just to humiliate her in front of everyone. Everyone laughed. Everyone except the billionaire, standing by the window. He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. What he did next made the whole ballroom go silent. You're about to hear one of the most emotional stories on the internet. Hey, welcome back, my friend. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I really want to know who's sitting with me for this one. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional, heartwarming, and jaw-dropping stories I've ever shared on this channel. A story about pride, cruelty, hidden history, and one decision that changed 3 lives forever. I promise you, by the end of this, you won't look at the help the same way again. Let's begin. Nobody in that ballroom knew her real name. The Cross estate sat on 11 acres overlooking the Hudson River, the kind of property that made even wealthy guests go quiet when they walked through the gates. Tonight, it was dressed for an engagement party. White orchids on every table, a live string quartet, and a chandelier so large it looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. 200 guests in tailored suits and floor-length gowns moved through the halls, champagne flutes catching the light. Nathaniel Cross stood near the tall windows overlooking the garden, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. At 34, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, having built Cross Dynamics from a garage in Ohio into a company worth billions. Forbes called him the quiet genius. His employees called him fair, sometimes distant, but never cruel. Tonight, though, he looked like a man attending someone else's party. His fiancée, Victoria Hale, 29, moved through the crowd like she owned gravity itself. She was beautiful in the practiced way, a smile calibrated for cameras, a laugh timed for effect. Her family had old money, older connections, and a name that opened doors Nathaniel's could not. Their engagement had been announced 3 months ago, splashed across society pages as the union of the decade. In the kitchen, behind the swinging doors that separated the party from the staff, a woman named Elena Ramirez adjusted her tray of champagne glasses for the 4th time. She was 28, with dark hair pulled back tightly and eyes that carried more history than her simple black uniform suggested. She had worked for the catering company for 2 years, and tonight was, by far, the largest event she'd ever staffed. "You okay?" whispered Marisol, a fellow server, noticing Elena's hands trembling slightly around the tray. "I'm fine," Elena said softly. "Just this house. It feels familiar somehow." Marisol laughed under her breath. "Girl, you've never been here before. You're just nervous. Big house, big money, big nerves. Happens to everyone." Elena nodded, though something in her chest disagreed. She pushed the swinging door open and stepped into the golden light of the ballroom. She didn't know that on the other side of that room, a man she hadn't seen in 20 years was standing by the window. Elena moved carefully between guests, offering champagne with practiced grace, murmuring "good evening," and "may I take that for you" in the soft, professional tone she'd trained herself to use. She was good at being invisible. In this world, invisibility was survival. Nobody remembered the maid's face, only whether the tray was empty or full. But there was something about tonight that unsettled her. The chandelier. The marble staircase curving up toward the 2nd floor. The smell of the garden roses drifting in from the open terrace doors. It all felt like déjà vu wrapped in silk. She didn't have time to think about it, because that's when Victoria Hale's voice cut through the music.
"You, girl.
Come here." Elena turned, tray still balanced perfectly in her hands, and found Victoria standing with 3 of her friends, all watching with a particular kind of smile that meant something was about to go wrong. "Yes, ma'am?" Elena asked politely. Victoria looked her up and down slowly, the way someone inspects a stain on a tablecloth. "This champagne is warm. Get me a cold one." "Of course. I'm so sorry." Elena reached for a fresh glass from her tray, careful, steady, professional. Victoria's friends exchanged glances, the kind that said they knew what was coming and were already enjoying it. Actually, Victoria said, tilting her head, never mind the champagne. I have a better idea. And in front of 200 guests, under the golden chandelier of the Cross Estate, Victoria Hale lifted her own glass of deep red wine and threw it directly onto Elena Ramirez. The music didn't stop. The quartet kept playing for 3 full seconds before the first gasp rippled through the crowd, because at first, nobody quite believed what they'd just seen. Elena stood frozen, red wine soaking through her white blouse, dripping down her collar, her tray shaking in her hands. The room, which had been a blur of laughter and clinking glasses, suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. And across that ballroom, by the window, Nathaniel Cross set down his scotch. His eyes were fixed on Elena's face, not her ruined uniform, not the wine staining the marble floor, but her face. Something about the shape of her eyes, the way she stood perfectly still instead of crying out, tugged at a memory buried so deep he hadn't touched it in over 20 years. He started walking toward her. Victoria, laughing softly with her friends, didn't notice him yet. "Oh, relax," she said to Elena, not even looking at her now. "It's just a uniform. I'm sure they have extras." The room began to murmur, some guests whispering in shock, a few even chuckling nervously, unsure whether to laugh along with the bride-to-be or feel sorry for the drenched young woman standing silently in the middle of the floor. Elena didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She simply lowered her tray, set it carefully on a nearby table so the remaining glasses wouldn't spill, and lifted her chin. And that's when Nathaniel reached her. He stopped just a few feet away, staring at her with an expression none of the guests had ever seen on his face before. Not anger, not pity, but something closer to disbelief. "Elena," he said quietly, almost to himself. The room went silent. Elena's eyes widened. Nobody had called her that name. Not in this house, not with that tone, since she was 8 years old. The silence stretched long enough that the string quartet finally noticed and let their bows fall still. Elena stared at Nathaniel, wine still dripping from her sleeve onto the marble floor, her mind racing to make sense of a face she hadn't seen in 2 decades but somehow still recognized in an instant. The same sharp jaw, the same steady brown eyes, just older now, more tired, more powerful. "Nate?" she whispered, the childhood nickname slipping out before she could stop it. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time all evening. "You two know each other?" Nathaniel didn't answer her. He was still looking at Elena as if she might disappear if he blinked. "Sunrise House," he said softly. "Room 14. You used to sneak me your dinner rolls because I never got enough at the group table." Elena let out a small, disbelieving laugh, though her eyes were shining with tears now. "You used to give me your library book so I could read during lights out." A few guests nearby leaned in, confused, sensing something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Victoria's friends had gone quiet too, watching their host's carefully composed fiancé blink in genuine confusion for the first time that night. "I looked for you," Nathaniel said, his voice lower now, meant only for her, though the room was so silent everyone could hear it anyway. "After I got adopted. I asked the Hendersons if we could find you."
They tried.
"The records were a mess. He stopped, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd see you again. I didn't think anyone would ever look," Elena said quietly. Victoria's expression hardened into something sharper. "I'm sorry, can someone explain what is happening right now?" "Nathaniel, you know this woman?" He finally turned to her, and something in his eyes had changed. The distant politeness he'd shown her for 3 months was gone, replaced by something colder. "I knew her before I knew you. Before I knew anyone, actually." He turned back to Elena. "You're bleeding," he said suddenly, noticing a thin line of red on her wrist where a broken piece of the wine glass had nicked her skin when it shattered against the tray. "Come with me. Please." "Nathaniel, she's deaf," Victoria said sharply, her voice rising just slightly, panic creeping beneath the irritation. "There's a first aid kit in the kitchen. I'm sure the caterers." "I said come with me," Nathaniel repeated, this time to Elena, ignoring Victoria entirely. He led her gently by the elbow through the crowd, past 200 guests who parted like water, whispering behind raised hands. Marisol, watching from near the kitchen doors, pressed a hand over her mouth in shock. Elena didn't look back at Victoria. She didn't need to. She could feel the woman's eyes burning into her back the entire way across the ballroom. They stepped into a quiet study just off the main hall, dark wood shelves, a fireplace crackling low, the noise of the party muffled behind the closed door. Nathaniel guided her to a leather armchair and knelt in front of her, taking her wrist gently to examine the small cut. "It's nothing," Elena said. "Really? I've had worse." "I know you have," he said, and something in the way he said it made her go still. "I remember, Elena. I remember everything." She looked at him carefully, the wine still soaking cold against her skin, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the injury. "It's been 20 years, Nate." "Nathaniel," he corrected softly, almost apologetically. "Everyone calls me Nathaniel now. Except, apparently, you, and it's the first time that name has sounded right in years." He found a first aid kit in a drawer of the desk and began cleaning the small cut on her wrist with careful, practiced hands, the same way, she realized with a jolt, he used to clean her scraped knees when they were children and the house matron was too busy to bother. "You disappeared," he said, not looking up from her wrist. "One day you were there, the next day they told me you'd been moved to another placement. I asked every week for a month. Then I stopped being allowed to ask." Elena swallowed hard. "There was an incident. A family wanted to adopt a child my age. Only one child. They picked me first." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "I told the caseworker I didn't want to go. I told her to give it to you instead. You needed it more than me. You were sick that whole winter, remember? I thought if I stayed at Sunrise, they'd eventually find you a home too. And if I left, maybe another kid would take my spot, and you'd lose your chance." Nathaniel's hands stilled completely. "I switched files," Elena continued. "I convinced the caseworker's assistant, a kind older woman, to switch our names on the paperwork. Told her I had family in another state who might still come for me, that you had no one. It wasn't entirely a lie. I just left out that my family didn't want me either." She let out a shaky breath. "You got adopted 3 weeks later. I got moved to another group home in Pennsylvania." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Nathaniel sat back on his heels, staring at her, the pieces of a 20-year-old mystery finally clicking into place, a mystery he had never even known needed solving. "You gave up your family," he said slowly, "so I could have mine." "You needed it more," Elena repeated simply, as if it were obvious, as if it had never once occurred to her that she'd done something extraordinary. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "Everything I built," he said quietly. "The company, this house, all of it, it started with the Hendersons giving me a chance. A chance you gave away." "I didn't give it away," Elena said gently. "I gave it to someone I loved." The word hung in the air between them, loved, spoken so simply, so honestly, that neither of them moved to take it back. Outside the study door, the party noise had shifted from murmurs to something louder. Victoria's voice, sharp and controlled even in anger, could be heard through the wood, demanding answers from anyone who would listen. Nathaniel stood slowly, still holding Elena's bandaged wrist gently in his hand. "I have to go back out there," he said. "But this conversation isn't over. Not even close." Elena nodded, though her chest was tight with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. Hope, dangerous and fragile. What neither of them knew yet was that Victoria Hale was not simply confused or embarrassed. She was afraid. Because 20 years ago, in a records office 3 states away, a young paralegal named Victoria's mother had quietly ensured that a certain adoption file got lost for a fee and a favor from a family who very much wanted a particular little girl kept far away from a particular little boy. Victoria stood by the marble staircase, arms crossed, watching the study door with an intensity that unsettled even her closest friends. "Vic, are you okay?" asked Bethany, one of her bridesmaids, touching her arm gently. "I'm fine," Victoria snapped, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I just don't understand why my fiancé, is in a private room with a maid. But the truth sitting cold in Victoria's stomach had nothing to do with jealousy over a workplace crush. It had everything to do with a secret she had buried for 2 decades, one she thought was buried deep enough that it would never resurface, especially not tonight, especially not in her own engagement party. Her mother, Patricia Hale, had been a paralegal at a family services office in Ohio 20 years ago, before she married into money and reinvented herself as a socialite. Patricia had once done a favor for a wealthy family friend, the Whitfields, who desperately wanted to adopt a specific little girl from Sunrise House, a girl named Elena Ramirez, believing she'd bring good luck to their household after losing a daughter of their own years earlier. There had been a complication. Elena had switched paperwork with another child, a boy named Nathaniel, to protect him. When the Whitfield family's lawyer discovered the switch, they were furious. They had wanted Elena specifically. Patricia, eager to please a family who paid handsomely and could open doors for her own daughter someday, quietly corrected the records, reinstating the Whitfields' claim and ensuring Elena's original placement request was buried entirely, along with any documentation of what Elena had tried to do for Nathaniel. The plan worked for the Whitfields. But Elena, through a fluke of bureaucratic chaos, never actually ended up placed with them. The family lost interest within months and moved on to a different agency, leaving Elena in the system, drifting from home to home for years, unaware that a child's selfless sacrifice had been erased and manipulated by adults chasing money and favors. Victoria had grown up hearing the story from her mother as a funny anecdote about problem-solving in the adoption industry, never realizing, until this very night, exactly whose life had been altered by it. Now, watching the study door, watching the way Nathaniel had looked at that maid, recognized her, remembered her, Victoria felt something cold settle into her chest. Because if Elena and Nathaniel started talking, really talking about Sunrise House, about switched files, about the Whitfields, her mother's name might come up. And Victoria's engagement, her carefully built future, her father-in-law-to-be's trust, all of it could crumble in an instant. She needed to get ahead of this. "Bethany," she said quietly, straightening her shoulders and fixing her smile back into place, "keep everyone entertained. I need to speak to my fiancé." She crossed the ballroom floor with purpose, guests parting for her the way they always did, and knocked once on the study door before pushing it open without waiting for an answer. Nathaniel and Elena both turned. Elena's wrist was freshly bandaged, resting in her lap, and there was an unmistakable closeness in the air between them that made Victoria's stomach twist harder. "Nathaniel," Victoria said, her voice sweet and strained, "our guests are asking about us. Perhaps we should return to the party and let the staff get back to work." "Victoria." Nathaniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now that hadn't been there 3 months ago when he'd proposed. "Elena isn't just staff. She's someone I grew up with. Someone I owe more than you could possibly imagine." "How touching," Victoria said, forcing a laugh. "A childhood reunion. Very sweet. But we have 200 guests waiting." Elena rose from the chair carefully. "I should get back to work. I don't want to cause any more trouble." She looked at Nathaniel. "Thank you for this." She lifted her bandaged wrist slightly. "Wait," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone made both women freeze. "Elena, what was the name of the family? The ones who wanted to adopt you specifically, the ones the caseworker mentioned when your files got mixed up?" Elena frowned, thinking back. "I don't remember exactly. I was 8. I just remember the caseworker's assistant, Miss Dana, I think, telling me a family had requested me by description, not just availability." "That's unusual," she said. "Most families didn't request specific children by physical description, only children fitting general criteria. It stuck with me because it felt strange, being chosen like that, and then somehow it all fell through anyway, and I never left Sunrise until months later, and even then it was to a completely different home." Nathaniel's eyes moved to Victoria, who had gone very still, her sweet smile frozen in place like a mask starting to crack. "Victoria," he said slowly, "your mother worked in family services in Ohio around that time, didn't she? Before she married your father?" The color drained from Victoria's face so completely that even Bethany, watching from the doorway, gasped audibly. Victoria started, then stopped. I don't know what you're implying, Nathaniel, but I think this conversation has gotten completely out of hand. I'm not implying anything, Nathaniel said quietly. I'm asking a question. But the way Victoria's hands were shaking, the way her carefully composed face had crumbled into something raw and panicked, told him he already had his answer, even before she turned and walked quickly out of the study, disappearing into the crowd of the ballroom without another word. Elena looked at Nathaniel, confusion and dawning realization mixing in her expression. Nate, what just happened? Nathaniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed suddenly forming a picture darker than he could have imagined. I think, he said quietly, someone made sure we never found each other. And I think I just figured out who. The rest of the party carried on in a strange, uneasy rhythm, guests laughing too loudly, the quartet playing too brightly, everyone pretending they hadn't just witnessed their hostess flee her own engagement celebration in tears. Nathaniel found Victoria 20 minutes later on the back terrace, alone, staring out at the dark garden, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. Talk to me, he said, standing a few feet away, his voice softer than his earlier tone in the study, but still firm. Victoria didn't turn around. You don't understand what it's like, she said quietly. Growing up watching my mother do whatever it took to keep us comfortable. She never saw it as wrong. She saw it as survival. The Whitfields paid her enough to put a down payment on our first real house. She always said it was a small thing, helping match families with kids, smoothing over a little paperwork. She never told me a name. She never told me it was you. But you knew something, Nathaniel said. Tonight, the moment you saw us together, you knew. Victoria finally turned to face him, tears streaking down her cheeks, her carefully maintained composure completely gone now. I heard the story once, years ago, at a family dinner. A drunk uncle joking about my mother's creative paperwork days. I didn't think about it again until I saw your face tonight, looking at that maid like she was the only person in the room. And I knew. I don't know how, but I knew it was connected. 2 children, Nathaniel said, his voice low and controlled despite the anger simmering beneath it. Lost each other for 20 years because your mother wanted a bonus and a favor from a family chasing some superstition about a specific little girl. Elena spent 2 decades bouncing through the foster system because a family lost interest in her within months, and by the time they did, the damage to her original placement was already done. She never got adopted at all, Victoria. Not by anyone. She aged out of the system at 18 with nothing. Victoria flinched as if he'd struck her. I didn't know that part. I swear I didn't. Would it have mattered if you had? Nathaniel asked quietly. Would you have told me? Before tonight, before you had no choice. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again, because they both already knew the answer. I need you to understand something, Nathaniel continued, stepping closer, his voice gentler now but no less resolute. This isn't really about your mother's mistake 20 years ago, Victoria. People make terrible choices for money, for convenience, and sometimes those choices ripple further than they ever imagined. I could almost find room to understand that, given time, what I can understand, what I won't accept, is who you've become in the 3 months I've known you. The way you looked at Elena tonight, before any of this came out. The way you've treated every server, every housekeeper, every person in this house who isn't wealthy enough to matter to you. That wine wasn't about a warm glass of champagne. That was about power. About making someone feel small because you could. Nathaniel, please. I propose to you, he said, cutting her off gently but firmly, because I thought I saw kindness underneath the polish. I think what I actually saw was good training. A performance you'd practiced your whole life. He shook his head slowly. I can't marry someone I'm afraid to leave alone with the people who work for me. Victoria's tears came harder now, but there was something different in them. Not manipulation, not performance, but genuine grief for a version of her future that was slipping irretrievably away. So, that's it? 20 minutes and 3 months are over. It's not about 20 minutes, Nathaniel said quietly. It's about everything those 20 minutes revealed. I need time to think about what comes next. But I know it doesn't involve a wedding. He turned and walked back inside, leaving Victoria alone on the terrace with the dark garden and the sound of her own shattered composure. Inside, Elena had changed into a spare blouse from the catering van, her damp uniform now hanging over her arm as she prepared to quietly finish her shift and disappear into the night the way she always did, invisible, professional, unnoticed. She was gathering empty glasses from a side table when Nathaniel found her again. "You don't have to keep working tonight," he said gently. "It's my job, Nate," she said, offering a small, tired smile. "I need this job." "Not tonight, you don't." He took the tray gently from her hands and set it aside. "Come with me, please. There's so much I need to tell you, and so much I need to ask." Elena hesitated, glancing around the ballroom at the guests who were beginning to notice, again, that something significant was unfolding beneath the surface of the party's forced cheer. "Nate," she said quietly, "I don't want to be the reason your engagement falls apart. I already gave up one family for you. I don't want to be the reason you lose another." Something in Nathaniel's expression softened at that, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that after everything, after her sacrifice, after 20 years of a system that failed her, after tonight's humiliation, her first instinct was still to protect him from consequences that weren't hers to carry. "Elena," he said softly, "you're not the reason anything is falling apart. You're the reason I'm finally seeing clearly." The days following the party moved fast, faster than Elena was prepared for. News of the broken engagement spread quickly through the social circles that mattered to people like Victoria Hale. Quiet whispers at charity luncheons, pointed glances at country clubs, the particular cruelty of a world that had once celebrated Victoria, now turning its curiosity toward her downfall. Victoria herself retreated from public life almost entirely, her family issuing a brief statement about amicably ending the engagement to pursue personal growth, though anyone who'd been in that ballroom knew the truth, was far less tidy. Elena, meanwhile, went back to her small apartment in Yonkers, back to her double shifts with the catering company, back to the life she'd built carefully and quietly for herself over the years. She told herself the encounter with Nathaniel had been a strange, emotional anomaly, a door to the past that had opened briefly and would close again soon enough, the way doors like that always did. But Nathaniel didn't let it close. He called her 3 days after the party, then 4 days after that. He asked to meet, not at some extravagant restaurant that would make her uncomfortable, but at a small diner near her apartment, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped refilling. "I need to tell you what I found," he said, sliding a folder across the table between them. Elena opened it carefully. Inside were copies of old records, adoption files, correspondence, and names she didn't recognize. Whitfield. "I hired a private investigator," Nathaniel explained. "After what happened at the party, after what Victoria admitted about her mother, I needed to know the full truth. Not for revenge. For you. You deserve to know what actually happened to you." Elena read through the document slowly, her hands trembling slightly as 2 decades of confusion began, finally, to make sense. The Whitfield family had specifically requested a child matching Elena's description after losing their own daughter to illness years earlier, an unusual, almost superstitious request that most agencies would have flagged, except Patricia Hale's involvement had smoothed the process along in exchange for compensation. When Elena's selfless switch with Nathaniel complicated things, Patricia had corrected the paperwork to satisfy the Whitfields, inadvertently or perhaps carelessly, erasing any record of Elena's original placement request in the process. The Whitfields lost interest within a few months, Nathaniel continued gently, watching Elena's face as she absorbed everything. Grief does strange things to people. They eventually decided pursuing adoption again was too painful and withdrew their application entirely. But because your file had already been altered, you didn't go back into normal placement rotation. You fell through the cracks of a system for years. It wasn't your fault, Elena. None of it was ever your fault. Elena set the folder down, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not tears of grief exactly, but of a strange, overwhelming relief, the kind that comes from finally understanding a wound you'd carried without a name for 20 years. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that something was wrong with me. That I did something to make families change their minds, home after home, over and over. I used to think I was just unlovable, unwanted. You gave away your own chance at a family to protect a sick, scared little boy, Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. There has never been anything wrong with you, Elena.
Not then. Not now.
They sat in silence for a long moment, the diner's ordinary noise, clinking silverware, a radio playing softly, the bell above the door chiming as customers came and went, providing an oddly gentle backdrop to a conversation that was rewriting both of their understandings of the past. What happens now? Elena finally asked. Nathaniel considered the question carefully. That depends on what you want. I'm not trying to fix 20 years with a checkbook, Elena. I know that's not how this works. But I don't want to lose you again either. Not as a friend. Not as... He paused, searching for the right words. Not as whatever this is becoming. Elena managed a small, watery laugh. You always did overthink things, even as a kid. You always did give away too much, he replied gently. Over the following weeks, their friendship rebuilt itself slowly and carefully, grounded in the shared language of two people who understood loss and survival in ways most of the people in Nathaniel's current world never could. He didn't rush anything. He didn't try to lift her out of her life and drop her into his the way a fairy tale might demand. Instead, he simply showed up. Dinners at that same diner, long phone calls, quiet Sunday walks through Central Park where nobody recognized the billionaire in the baseball cap and worn jacket. But beneath the surface of this gentle rebuilding, something else was quietly happening. Nathaniel had begun a full internal review of Cross Dynamics' philanthropic foundation, and an idea was taking shape, something that would honor not just what Elena had done for him as a child, but what she continued to represent. Quiet, selfless strength in a world that too often rewarded cruelty and performance instead. He wasn't ready to share it with her yet. Not until he was certain it was right. Victoria's world, meanwhile, was unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her mother, Patricia, initially dismissed the entire situation with practiced denial when Victoria confronted her at the family's Connecticut estate. It was 20 years ago, Patricia said, waving a manicured hand as though swatting away an inconvenient fly. Nobody remembers those details. Nobody can prove anything. Nathaniel can, Victoria said quietly. He has documents, Mom. He hired investigators. This isn't going away. Patricia's confidence cracked, just slightly, the mask of composed denial slipping to reveal something closer to fear. What does he want? Money? We can arrange. He doesn't want money, Victoria snapped, years of frustration boiling over. He wants to understand how two children got separated because you wanted a bonus and a favor from rich clients. The conversation ended in silence, the kind of heavy, unresolved silence that had defined most of Victoria's relationship with her mother for years, a relationship built on appearances rather than honesty, on comfortable lies rather than difficult truths. In the weeks that followed, Victoria found herself, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, genuinely reflecting on who she'd become. She thought about the way she'd looked at Elena that night, not really seeing her, not really considering her a person with a history, a story, a heart capable of extraordinary sacrifice. She thought about all the servers, housekeepers, and staff she'd treated the same way over the years, invisible props in the elaborate performance of her privileged life. She didn't reach out to Nathaniel. She knew that door was closed, and some part of her, the part not yet consumed by wounded pride, understood that it should stay closed. But she did reach out, quietly and without publicity, to a non-profit organization that supported aging-out foster youth, the population Elena had once belonged to before falling through every crack the system offered. She began volunteering there anonymously, not for redemption points or social capital, but because it was the first genuinely selfless thing she'd chosen to do since childhood, and something about it felt necessary in a way she couldn't fully articulate even to herself. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a start, the kind of quiet, unglamorous start that real change usually requires, far from ballrooms and headlines and the performance of goodness Victoria had spent her whole life perfecting instead of actually practicing. Meanwhile, at Cross Dynamics, Nathaniel finalized the details of what would become the most personally significant project of his professional life. The Sunrise Initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting foster youth who aged out of the system without ever finding permanent homes, funding education, housing assistance, mentorship programs, and emergency support for young people navigating adulthood without the family safety nets most people took for granted. He didn't want to simply write checks and put his name on a building. He wanted the foundation built by someone who understood the system from the inside, someone who could design programs that actually addressed the specific, painful gaps that bureaucratic indifference and human cruelty created, gaps Elena had lived through firsthand. He requested a meeting with her, this time not at the diner, but at his company's headquarters, in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. "I want you to run it," he said simply, sliding a proposal across the table toward her. Not as a token gesture. Not as a thank you gift. As the executive director, with full authority over programming, with a salary that reflects genuine executive leadership, with real power to build something that would have actually helped you, Elena, if it had existed 20 years ago. Elena stared at the proposal, stunned into silence for a long moment. "Nate, I don't have an executive background. I have a high school diploma and 2 years of community college I couldn't finish because I had to work." "You have 20 years of lived experience that no MBA could ever teach," Nathaniel said firmly. "I'll provide you with whatever operational support and training you need. But the vision, the priorities, the understanding of what actually matters, that has to come from you. I've hired plenty of executives with impressive resumes who understand spreadsheets. I need someone who understands what it feels like to give up everything for another person and then spend 2 decades wondering if you mattered to anyone at all." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, the third time in as many weeks that this man had managed to reach directly into the most guarded parts of her heart. "You're not doing this because you feel sorry for me, are you?" "I'm doing this," Nathaniel said quietly, "because you're the most capable, selfless, extraordinary person I have ever known, and I refuse to let the world keep treating you like you're invisible." Elena said yes. The following months were a whirlwind of learning, growth, and quiet transformation. Nathaniel paired her with an experienced nonprofit consultant who helped her understand budgeting, grant writing, and organizational structure, but the heart of the foundation's design was entirely Elena's, informed by every painful gap she'd experienced firsthand. The lack of guaranteed housing for youth aging out at 18, the absence of consistent mentorship, the terrifying financial cliff young people face the moment the system stopped supporting them. She built the Sunrise Initiative around 3 core pillars: guaranteed transitional housing until age 23, mandatory mentorship pairing every young person with an adult advocate for at least 5 years, and an education fund covering both traditional college and vocational training, because Elena understood firsthand that not every path to stability looked the same. Word of the foundation spread through both philanthropic and foster care advocacy circles, drawing attention not just for its funding but for the authenticity of its design, a rarity in an industry often dominated by well-meaning but disconnected donors. Elena found herself, for the first time in her life, in rooms full of powerful people who listened when she spoke, not because of her title or her connection to Nathaniel Cross, but because what she said carried the unmistakable weight of lived truth. Nathaniel watched her transformation with quiet pride, careful never to overshadow her growing confidence with his own presence or reputation. He attended foundation events as a supporter, not a spokesperson, deliberately stepping back so that Elena's voice, not his wealth, defined the organization's public identity. Their relationship, too, continued evolving with the same patient, unhurried honesty that had characterized it from the beginning. There was no grand, theatrical declaration of romance, just a steady accumulation of trust, laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations that slowly, naturally, deepened into something neither of them rushed to name. It was Elena who finally said it first, 6 months after that ruined engagement party, sitting together on a quiet bench in Central Park during one of their Sunday walks. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said simply, watching a group of children play near the pond. "Which terrifies me a little, honestly, because the last time I loved someone this much, I gave up everything for him and then didn't see him again for 20 years. Nathaniel took her hand gently. I'm not going anywhere this time, Elena. I promise you that. You can't actually promise that, she said, smiling despite herself. Life doesn't work that way. No, he agreed. But I can promise I'll never stop looking for you if we ever get separated again. And I can promise that whatever happens, you'll never wonder if you mattered to me. Not for one single day. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was something arguably more important. A genuine, unguarded commitment between two people who had already survived the hardest kind of separation imaginable and found their way back to each other against every statistical improbability. Word of their relationship eventually reached the public, though far more gently than the dramatic engagement party months earlier. A photo of them together at a foundation gala. Elena in a simple navy dress rather than borrowed designer gowns, Nathaniel's arm around her waist as they laughed at something off-camera, went quietly viral, not for scandal, but for the visible, unmistakable authenticity radiating between them, a stark contrast to the polished performance that had defined his previous engagement. Social media users who'd heard whispers of the original ballroom incident pieced together the story, and soon Elena's history, carefully shared with her permission, framed respectfully rather than exploitatively, became public knowledge. Instead of shame, she found something she'd never expected, an outpouring of support from thousands of former foster youth who recognized pieces of their own stories in hers, who found hope in watching someone who'd fallen through every crack the system offered ultimately build something to catch others before they fell too. 1 year after the ballroom incident that had briefly humiliated her in front of 200 strangers, Elena Ramirez stood in that same ballroom again, except this time, she wasn't holding a serving tray. The Sunrise Initiative's first annual gala filled the Cross estate with warmth instead of cold performance, the same chandelier casting golden light over a room full of foundation supporters, foster care advocates, former foster youth now thriving in college or careers thanks to the foundation's support, and community leaders eager to expand the model to other cities. Elena stood at a small podium near the same window where Nathaniel had once stood watching her get humiliated, and she looked out at a crowd that had gathered not to gossip or judge, but to celebrate something real. A year ago, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest, I stood in this exact room in a caterer's uniform, and someone poured a glass of wine over me to remind me of my place in this world. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some guests exchanging glances, having heard whispers of the story, but never the full truth from Elena herself. I want to thank that moment, actually, because it led to a conversation with someone I hadn't seen in 20 years, and that conversation revealed a truth I'd carried without words my entire life, that being poor, being unwanted, being pushed through a broken system, never once meant I was worth less than anyone else in this room. She looked toward the back of the room, where Nathaniel stood watching her with unmistakable pride, and continued. Tonight, we're here because of a promise that every young person who ages out of foster care deserves housing, mentorship, and a real chance at building a life, not just a folder of paperwork and a goodbye. In our first year, the Sunrise Initiative has housed 43 young people, funded 18 college enrollments and 11 vocational certifications, and connected every single participant with a dedicated mentor who won't disappear the moment they turn 18. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, sustained, nothing like the awkward, performative claps that had followed announcements at that engagement party a year earlier. After her speech, as guests mingled and the string quartet resumed playing, Nathaniel found her near the same terrace doors where he'd once confronted Victoria in tears. You were incredible up there, he said, taking her hand. I was terrified, Elena admitted, laughing softly. You didn't look terrified. You looked like exactly who you are, someone who turned her worst night into something extraordinary. He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket, his expression suddenly more serious, more vulnerable than she'd seen in months. Elena, I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I think tonight in this room is exactly the right moment. He knelt down, and Elena's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. 20 years ago, he said, opening a small box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. You gave up your own chance at a family to make sure I had mine. I spent 2 decades not knowing what I'd lost, and 1 year learning exactly how extraordinary you are. I don't want to spend one more day without officially, permanently, making sure you know you have a family, one that chose you, not out of superstition or convenience, but because you are, without question, the most remarkable person I have ever known. Elena Ramirez, will you marry me? The room, sensing the moment unfolding, had gone quiet again, but this time, the silence wasn't shock or discomfort. It was collective, breathless anticipation. Elena, tears streaming freely down her face, nodded before she could even find her voice. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, of course, yes. The ballroom erupted in applause and cheers, guests wiping their own eyes, servers pausing near the kitchen doors to smile and clap along, Marisol among them, grinning so widely her face nearly split in two. Their wedding, 6 months later, was intentionally small and unpretentious compared to the extravagant engagement party that had once defined Nathaniel's public life, held not in a sprawling mansion, but in a modest garden venue that Elena had chosen specifically for its warmth rather than its grandeur. Marisol stood as Elena's maid of honor, having become one of her closest friends over the 2 years they'd worked catering shifts together. Several graduates of the Sunrise Initiative attended as honored guests rather than charity cases, seated among Nathaniel's business associates and childhood friends from Sunrise House, the actual group home where he and Elena had first met as frightened, hopeful children. There was no dramatic twist at this wedding, no shocking reveal, no cruel gesture from an entitled guest. Just two people who had survived extraordinary separation, extraordinary sacrifice, and extraordinary reunion, finally standing together in front of people who genuinely loved them. In his vows, Nathaniel spoke about the dinner rolls Elena used to sneak him as a hungry, scared 8-year-old, about the years he spent wondering what had happened to the girl who disappeared from his life without explanation, and about the profound, humbling gratitude he felt every single day realizing that his entire adult success existed because a little girl once decided his need mattered more than her own comfort. In her vows, Elena spoke about learning, after decades of believing she was unwanted and unlovable, that the family she'd been searching for all along wasn't something she'd lost. It was something she'd built, first through an act of selfless love at 8 years old, and then again as an adult willing to trust that love could find its way back to her even after 20 years of silence. As for Victoria, she wasn't at the wedding, nor would anyone have expected her to be. But 2 years after that fateful engagement party, she published a quiet, unpublicized op-ed in a small nonprofit newsletter about her volunteer work with foster youth, writing candidly about confronting inherited privilege, inherited cruelty, and the difficult, ongoing work of unlearning the belief that some people's comfort matters more than others' dignity. She never mentioned Elena or Nathaniel by name.
She didn't need to.
The people who knew the story understood exactly what had prompted her transformation, and those who didn't simply read a thoughtful reflection on privilege and personal growth from a woman quietly rebuilding her character far from the spotlight she'd once craved. Patricia Hale, for her part, eventually made a private financial contribution to the Sunrise Initiative, not publicized, not celebrated, but accepted by Elena and Nathaniel as a small, imperfect step toward accountability that neither of them needed for their own healing, but that mattered nonetheless for the young people the foundation continued to serve. 5 years after that engagement party, the Sunrise Initiative had expanded to 12 cities across the country, supporting over 3,000 young people transitioning out of foster care with housing, mentorship, and educational opportunities that had never existed for Elena or countless others like her. Elena, now executive director of a nationally recognized foundation, still occasionally found herself walking through the halls of the Cross Estate, glancing at the exact spot in the ballroom where a glass of wine had once been thrown to humiliate her, and feeling not shame or anger, but a strange, grateful wonder at how completely that painful moment had transformed into the foundation of everything meaningful in her life. She and Nathaniel had a daughter by then, a bright-eyed 2-year-old named Grace, who would grow up hearing the story of her parents' childhood friendship, their painful separation, and their extraordinary reunion. not as a fairy tale removed from reality, but as living proof that kindness, sacrifice, and integrity mattered, even when the world seemed determined to reward cruelty and privilege instead. Every year, on the anniversary of that engagement party, Elena and Nathaniel hosted a small gathering at Sunrise House itself, now renovated and expanded thanks to foundation funding, inviting current residents, alumni, and staff to a simple dinner celebrating not wealth or status, but community, resilience, and the quiet, powerful belief that every child, regardless of circumstance, deserved to know they mattered. At one such gathering, a young resident named Marcus, 12 years old and newly arrived at Sunrise House after a difficult placement fell through, asked Elena the question she'd come to expect and cherish answering each year. Is it true you used to live here? That you gave up getting adopted so some other kid could? Elena knelt down to his level, the way someone once might have knelt to comfort her at his age, though no one ever had. It's true, she said gently. And you know what I learned? Sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself is take care of someone else first. Not because you're supposed to sacrifice everything, but because real love, real kindness, has a way of finding its way back to you, even when it takes a very long time. Marcus considered this seriously, the way children often consider truths adults have long forgotten how to fully believe. So things can still turn out okay? Even if they're really, really hard right now. They can turn out more than okay, Elena said, smiling as she watched Nathaniel across the room, laughing with a group of teenagers about something on his phone, their daughter Grace perched happily on his shoulders. Sometimes they turn out more beautiful than you could have ever imagined. And that, my friend, is the story of the maid who was humiliated in front of 200 strangers and the billionaire who remembered exactly who she was underneath that ruined uniform. If this story taught us anything tonight, it's this. Kindness is never wasted, even when it takes 20 years to come back to you. The people who make us feel small often reveal more about their own emptiness than they do about our worth. And sometimes, the family we're searching for isn't something we've lost. It's something we build, one selfless choice at a time. If this story touched your heart even a little, do me a favor, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you're new here, because we share stories just like this one every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder tonight that kindness always finds its way back, please share this with them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.